For years, a single narrative has dominated the conversation about China's rise. Western media and political speeches often assume that as Beijing gains power, its final goal is to knock the United States off its pedestal and take over as the sole ruler of the world. The logic behind this assumption is that China will eventually repeat the post-World War II American playbook, building global alliances, policing foreign borders, and attempting to reshape other countries in its own image. But there is a possibility that this assumption is built on a Western blind spot. What if China's actual strategy is the exact opposite of what we've been told to expect? To understand Beijing's true intentions, we have to look past the fears in Washington and analyze what the Chinese government explicitly teaches its own population and officials. The Chinese government produced a massive documentary series called The Rise and Fall of Nations, which was broadcast repeatedly on state television as mandatory political education for officials across the country. The series was designed to help the leadership understand the specific mechanics of how historical great powers achieved success and why they eventually collapsed. Out of all the empires discussed, only two nations were given two full episodes, the United States and the Soviet Union. For Beijing, these two nations serve as the primary examples of modern superpower success and catastrophic failure. Chinese analysts concluded that the Soviet Union failed because it prioritized military competition while its domestic economy stagnated. They watched the USSR spend enormous amounts of money on its armed forces before its internal systems were truly ready to support that burden. Eventually, the cost of maintaining that global military presence while the people faced poverty became too much to bear, and the Soviet Union collapsed. In contrast, Beijing saw that the United States became the dominant global power by focusing first on industrialization and infrastructure. America built factories, universities, and massive wealth for decades before it ever attempted to take on a global leadership role. This chart shows the total GDP of both nations, where they appear as near peers. However, even with the world's second-largest economy, Chinese officials continue to describe China as a developing nation. This label is based on the GDP per person. When you account for population, the average wealth in the U.S. is still several times higher than in China. These observations suggest that Beijing's priority is to avoid the Soviet mistake of sacrificing internal development for global ambition. They are currently focused on reaching a higher stage of national wealth before considering the responsibilities of global management. For the last 200 years, the British and Americans have operated with the belief that their values are universal. This mindset often includes a mission to spread their political systems to other parts of the world. This belief has frequently led to expensive overseas interventions, with the goal of trying to help transform other countries into democracies. China, however, views its own political system as unique to its specific history and culture. Consequently, Chinese officials rarely talk about exporting their political model, and instead argue that each country should choose its own path. This shows why China's influence in the global south is primarily economic. Projects like the Belt and Road Initiative focus on securing resources and trade access without demanding that those countries adopt Chinese-style politics. From Beijing's perspective, it may be beneficial for the United States to continue the expensive work of policing global shipping lanes and protecting regional security, while China focuses its resources on manufacturing and technology. If China is not pursuing a global ideological empire, then what is the primary motivation behind its rapid expansion? Much of China's strategy is rooted in the history of the Century of Humiliation, a period of foreign invasions, civil war, and widespread poverty. This history helps explain the current emphasis on domestic projects, such as building the world's largest high-speed rail network and pursuing technological independence. Even China's military buildup appears more focused on regional deterrence and protecting what it sees as core national interests, rather than creating a global police force. The evidence suggests that the grand strategy is not to rule the world, but to ensure that China is finally powerful enough that it can never be pushed around by foreign powers again. If this is true, the real geopolitical risk may not be a Chinese imperial takeover, but the possibility of the West exhausting itself to counter an ambition that Beijing does not actually hold.